You know that small moment when your hand moves toward your pocket before you even think about it. Maybe you're in the middle of reading something, or listening to someone speak, or simply sitting in a quiet room, and suddenly there's that faint sensation, a vibration, a subtle buzz. It's so familiar that your body reacts almost instantly. Your hand reaches for your phone. Your eyes drop toward the screen. But when you look, there's nothing there. No message, no notification, no missed call. Just a blank screen staring back at you. For a second you might pause, slightly confused. Maybe you assume you imagined it. Or maybe you quickly move on without thinking about it too much. But the strange part is how often this happens. Not once, not twice, but enough times that it starts to feel oddly familiar. And if you've ever noticed yourself checking your phone repeatedly, even when you know it probably hasn't buzzed, you might have quietly wondered what that says about you. People often joke about this behavior. They call it phone addiction, or lack of discipline, or the inability to disconnect. There's a quiet cultural story that suggests constantly checking your phone means you're distracted, impatient, or overly dependent on technology. But the truth is that the experience many people are having with their phones is not simply a matter of willpower. It's a pattern that has more to do with how the human brain adapts to its environment than with any personal weakness. And once you look at it from that perspective, something interesting begins to emerge. Because that strange moment when you feel your phone vibrate even though it didn't, actually has a name. Psychologists sometimes refer to it as phantom vibration syndrome. And while the phrase sounds unusual, the experience itself has quietly become one of the most common sensory illusions of the digital age. What makes it fascinating is that it isn't really about the phone. It's about the brain. More specifically, it's about how the brain learns to anticipate signals that might matter. Human perception is not as simple as it feels. Most people imagine that the brain passively receives information from the world, that our senses simply report what is happening around us. But modern neuroscience paints a slightly different picture. The brain is not just reacting to reality. It is constantly predicting it. There is a model in cognitive science known as predictive processing. The idea is surprisingly simple. Your brain is always trying to guess what will happen next. It builds expectations based on patterns it has seen before. Then it compares those expectations to incoming sensory signals. Most of the time, this system works quietly in the background. It allows you to recognize faces quickly, anticipate sounds, and navigate familiar environments without thinking. But when the brain becomes highly trained to expect something, it can sometimes detect that thing even when it isn't there. And modern smartphones have quietly trained our brains in exactly this way. Over the past decade, phones have become one of the most consistent sources of emotionally meaningful signals in daily life. A message from someone you care about, a response to something you posted, a piece of news that changes your day. Each notification carries the possibility of something socially important, and the brain pays very close attention to signals that might affect social connection. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. For most of human history, being alert to social signals meant survival. A gesture from a friend, a warning from a group member, a shift in someone's tone. These cues could determine safety, belonging, and cooperation. The modern notification has quietly taken on a similar role. That small buzz in your pocket now represents the possibility of connection, or recognition, or information that might matter to your social world. And when something carries that kind of potential importance, the brain begins to watch for it very carefully. Over time, this repeated anticipation begins to reshape perception itself. Researchers studying smartphone behavior have noticed that people who receive frequent notifications begin to develop heightened sensitivity to physical sensations near where they carry their phones. A small muscle twitch, the brush of fabric, a slight shift in posture. Under normal circumstances, the brain might ignore these signals. But when the brain expects a notification, it sometimes interprets these tiny sensations as the signal it has learned to expect, which means the brain isn't really hallucinating. It's predicting, and sometimes that prediction arrives a fraction of a second before reality confirms it. So the experience of a phantom vibration isn't necessarily a sign that something is wrong with your attention. It can simply mean that your brain has become highly practiced at detecting something it believes might matter. But there is another psychological layer beneath this process that makes it even more compelling. because notifications do not arrive in a predictable pattern. Sometimes you receive several messages within minutes. Other times your phone remains silent for hours. And that unpredictability turns out to be extremely important. In behavioral psychology, there is a concept known as variable ratio reinforcement. It describes a pattern of rewards that appear randomly rather than consistently. This same principle is used in many environments where maintaining attention is important. Slot machines work this way. You don't win every time you pull the lever, but occasionally you do. And the unpredictability of the reward makes the behavior remarkably persistent. The brain becomes curious, expectant, alert. Checking again begins to feel natural. Not because each check is rewarding, but because one of them might be. Digital notifications quietly operate under the same psychological principle. Most of the time when you check your phone, nothing particularly interesting has happened, but sometimes something meaningful appears. A message from someone you've been thinking about. A piece of information you've been waiting for. A small signal that you matter to someone in that moment. And because those moments arrive unpredictably, the brain begins to stay alert for them. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet background hum of attention. Over time, this subtle expectation becomes woven into daily awareness. The phone sits nearby. The possibility of a signal exists. And the brain, always trying to stay one step ahead of important information, keeps listening for the buzz, even when the buzz never actually happens. And this is where phantom notifications begin to make a little more sense, not as a technological glitch, but as a reflection of how adaptable the human brain really is. Over time, something subtle begins to happen inside this pattern. The brain doesn't just respond to notifications anymore. It begins to organize attention around the possibility of them. You might notice this during moments that used to feel quiet, standing in a line, waiting for someone to arrive, sitting on a bus or train with nothing urgent to do. Years ago, those small pauses in the day often passed without much interruption. The mind drifted, thoughts wandered, attention rested. But now, many people experience those same moments slightly differently. There is a quiet awareness of the phone, not always consciously, just a small background sense that something might appear there. A message, an update, a signal from somewhere else. And when the brain learns that important information might arrive at any moment, it adapts in the way it always has throughout human history. It becomes vigilant, not anxious in an obvious sense, just slightly more alert to potential signals. That subtle vigilance is part of why phantom notifications feel so convincing. Your nervous system has learned that a tiny vibration could represent something socially meaningful. So when the brain receives an ambiguous sensation, it fills in the most familiar explanation. The phone must have buzzed. This process is not unusual. Human perception has always worked this way. For example, if you are expecting to hear your name in a crowded room, your brain becomes remarkably good at detecting even faint versions of that sound. You might notice it from across the room, even when people are speaking quietly. But occasionally, the brain will misinterpret other sounds as your name, not because your hearing failed, but because your brain was prepared to hear it. The same thing is happening with phantom notifications. Your brain has simply become prepared to feel them, and when the mind becomes tuned to a signal, it becomes surprisingly good at detecting patterns that resemble it. But there is another consequence of this constant anticipation that researchers have been paying attention to. It has to do with how attention itself is structured. Each time your phone buzzes, your attention shifts. You move from one mental space into another. Perhaps you were reading something. Then suddenly you're responding to a message. Then maybe you're checking another app while you're there. Then returning to what you were doing before. Psychologists sometimes describe this as task switching. And while the shift might feel quick and effortless, the brain actually pays a small cognitive cost each time it happens. Focus becomes fragmented, not in a dramatic way, but in many small pieces across the day. Over time, the mind begins to expect interruption, which means that even when there is no notification, the brain still holds a portion of its attention in reserve, listening, waiting, ready to switch tasks again. This is sometimes why people describe feeling mentally scattered after long periods of phone interaction, not necessarily because the phone itself is harmful, but because the brain has spent hours moving between different streams of attention. What makes this particularly interesting is that many people are aware of this pattern and still feel pulled toward checking their phones. They might even notice themselves unlocking the screen without remembering why. And this can create a quiet sense of frustration, as if the habit exists slightly outside conscious control. But when psychologists look at this behavior closely, it often reveals something less troubling than it appears. The human brain is designed to prioritize signals that might affect belonging, safety, or social connection. Throughout history, those signals usually came from people physically nearby. A voice, a gesture, a shift in someone's facial expression. But today, many of those signals arrive through devices, so the brain has simply extended its sensitivity into a new environment. It has learned that a small digital vibration might carry information that once would have come from someone standing right beside you. In that sense, the brain isn't malfunctioning. It's adapting, quietly updating its model of where social signals come from. And once you see it that way, the constant awareness of your phone begins to look less like a failure of attention and more like an extension of a very old human instinct. The instinct to stay connected, to notice when someone reaches out, to respond when the social environment changes. Of course, different people relate to this pattern in different ways. Some feel comfortable letting notifications arrive whenever they do. Others eventually decide to create small boundaries around their devices, turning off certain alerts, leaving the phone in another room while they work, checking messages at specific times rather than continuously. Neither approach is inherently better. They simply reflect different ways of balancing connection and attention. What matters more is understanding why the impulse to check appears so naturally in the first place. Because once the pattern becomes visible, something interesting tends to happen. The experience often feels a little less mysterious. Instead of interpreting that urge to check your phone as a personal weakness, it becomes easier to see it as a learned rhythm between your brain and your environment. A rhythm shaped by years of subtle reinforcement, a rhythm that developed gradually, one notification at a time. And when people begin to notice that rhythm, they often discover that awareness alone softens the urgency of it. The phone might still buzz, or it might not, but the moment begins to feel slightly more spacious. A small pause appears between the sensation and the reaction, and in that pause, something quietly reassuring becomes visible. Your mind is not broken. Your attention has not been permanently damaged. Your brain has simply been doing what it has always done, learning the patterns of the world around it, adapting to signals that might matter, trying in its own careful way to keep you connected to the social fabric of your life. And sometimes that process leads to small illusions, a vibration that never happened, a notification that exists only in expectation. But those moments are also reminders of something deeper about the human mind. We are creatures designed to anticipate meaning, to search for signals, to stay attuned to connection. If the experience of phantom notifications feels familiar, it may simply be another quiet example of how sensitive the brain becomes to the things that shape our relationships and our sense of belonging. And once you begin to notice how many subtle psychological patterns exist beneath everyday habits like this, it becomes clear that some of the smallest behaviors in daily life are actually windows into how the mind protects our attention, our relationships, and our sense of place in the world. And there are many more patterns like this, quiet, ordinary experiences that reveal far more about the inner workings of the human mind than most people ever realize. Dear viewer, how was our today's video? If you found this video valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. We post simplified psychology explainer videos daily. If this is your area of interest, you really need to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so that you get notified every time we upload new videos. Share our videos to those who might benefit from them. Give us your genuine comments. We read all comments. We will see you in our next video. Until then, stay safe and stay blessed.